This is IBM Museum, and I want to do hopefully a quick video showing how the real-time clock on what ultimately is the MUL 30 planar. I've got that IBM 7496 executive workstation behind me, but it's got a MUL 30 planar in it. So all the real-time clock and everything else that's how it is set up on the MUL 30 planar. And the executive workstation, as many of the MUL 30s that were released, have a revision 02 BIOS. IBM actually released 4 different versions. They had a revision 00, which was the initial release. And it's even interesting that was, I think, even in the September of 1986, even the previous year before the PS2s were released. Then they have a revision 01 and a revision 02. And all those happened even ultimately before the PS2 series came out, with the MUL 30 being at the lower end of the spectrum, that range of the PS2, and really the only 8-bit or ISA bus initial PS2 that was released. And revision 03 of the BIOS was not released in the wild. I've found no evidence of it occurring, although there is a revision 4 BIOS, or 04, that is the latest BIOS that can be used on a MUL 30 that IBM released. As I say, the revision 02 is what we're working with in this instance, although I'll have aspects of the revision 04 BIOS for later on, and we'll see what changes are ultimately there. Now I'm going to be going through, I'll ultimately get turned around and I'll be flipping between input sources again. I do want to go through, I can probably handle, or think people can handle the phase difference as I go through and move one location, and then the camcorder having, of course, that delay. I do want to present what I've got on that back screen, the code that I'm going to be putting in addition to some other, trying to get some other information out and putting information in relating to the time and date. Now, I'm not going to be going through and using this DOS boot diskette at all. I have it ejected from the drive. So I'm going through, when I power on the unit from the monitor here, I've got it into my video capture that I'll have to switch over. But going through, and I'll work with this code. I just want to kind of show what it is. In fact, I wonder if I can capture that somehow, maybe, to have that on the screen in an area that I'm working with as well. So let me go through and do that and get that set up, and then I think we'll be good for when I switch over to the video capture. And okay, I've got it set up to how I will get it displayed on the screen once I have that video capture, just so people can see how that relates, although they'll see me type it in as well. And so I'm going to go through, let's get the executive workstation powered up. And go through to get it switched over. And we can see it, of course, counting the RAM memory. It goes through and checks the diskette drive. It says, hey, I don't have a diskette in there. So insert the diskette and do F1 to continue. Well, just if you do F1, it'll go through and it gets us into the ROM-BASIC. I'm going to go through and I'm going to put the text up, although at some point here, I'll go through and pause as I type this in to the system, just because you don't want to have to stick around and wait for my little two-fingered typist here. So I've gone through and I have it typed in, and let me just go through the listing a little bit. So on line 10, which is the start of the program, I have for I equals, and I'm having to specify for ROM-BASIC here that this is hexadecimal that I want to work with. And I could go through and I could, say 1 to whatever. This is the range of the for loop, but I want to have it actually to where I just put in and give it the starting input, the starting IO port value that I want to read up to the last. And that's easy enough to do. I don't have to convert it over to decimal, just have to say, hey, I'm interested in IO port E0 to EF, and of course that's hexadecimal, for that entire IO port range of the real-time clock. As we've seen in that previous video, I did even the short video of the real-time IO port viewer that shows that line as it ticks through the seconds and things like that, turning over. So we've got our loop set up of the parameters, the starting point to the end point. On our next line of 20, we go through and we create a variable string to say, hey, this is D string, but it's actually empty when it enters the loop. And I say that that is equal to D string. And what I'm doing is I'm building up a string as I retrieve the values. And so it's taking the prior as it goes through this loop. The first time it goes through, that D string is empty, but it goes through and gets this value from the port. And the next time it repeats the for loop, it goes through and concatenates or actually appends at the end appends at the end the new value of D string. So I'm going through and it's taking what D string is and adding on each time it goes through this for loop to that D string. And I'm going through and saying D string plus a space because I want to separate those values each port read that I do. And this is basic, ROM-BASIC. It's a rather slow interpreted process that the system is doing, that it doesn't need to have the kind of a spacers or timing to the back-to-back IO port reads. It's going to read the ports fine, just in the being an interpreted language, and it's slow enough a process that the IO ports are going to respond correctly in this instance. And of course, a modern day program running on a very fast computer, if you're doing port reads, you want to go through and have gaps in that so the system can go through and is reading the correct port. Just basically a timing loop or something to space out the back-to-back port reads. A lot of time it'll be the instance to where you're writing or inputting another just fake or null port basically to go through and let the system keep up with you. Now, after the space, I want to convert that over to the hexadecimal notation that is familiar with from the clock, because this is BCD values that are within that. We don't necessarily need to see, and that's binary coded decimal, but we want to see it represented as that hexadecimal notation rather than a decimal number necessarily. And it's going through and so it's converting to a hex string of the input from a port. IMP is input from a port of that I value. So the first time through the loop, it's inputting from the E0 hexadecimal port. The next time around, it's going through and reading from E1 hex, E2 hex, E3 hex, so on and so forth until it gets to that final IO port register of the real-time clock at EF hex. And so then line 30 is next I. That goes through and increments the I value, stepping from E0 to EF hex to repeat that for loop. By the time it reaches EF hex, it knows that the for loop is completed. So it goes out to line 40 of printing this this value of the, and actually it's kind of good that I looked because it is, this keyboard doesn't do a D so well. It's for being a new model M and everything else, or new included with the executive workstation, that D is just a little bit sensitive. So I've got the listing here correctly, at least, so it wouldn't give us an error. Now, before we do this, and certainly we can go through and we can list the program just to verify. And I went through, of course, early on, and I turned on the caps lock just to get in that format. So we have what is shown there for the screen of what we're needing to type in, and also have it displayed, of course, on my monitor that I could see as I went through to put it in as well. But before I do that, I want to do this. We're going to say print okay. Now date string is a string that in ROM-BASIC that is supposed to be to display the date in a certain format. So when we do that, it's blank. There's nothing there. That string is actually uninitialized. It's in an uninitialized state for the use in ROM-BASIC. It doesn't go through and retrieve that from the real-time clock at all, at least with this revision 02 BIOS. Now, ROM-BASIC is really simple too, and it doesn't necessarily, the instance where the ROM-BASIC it's not set up or loaded to, that it knows how to go through and load those values from the system to be able to work with them, that you're wanting to go through. It's just for a program that you went through and you set the date, and you could even have the person going through and entering the date in a basic program. Now we also entered ROM-BASIC, which is referred to as cassette basic with the original IBM PC, and we did that at boot up instead of going through and using that basic or advanced basic program stub to enter into that from the DOS command line. In that instance, we could actually return to system, and that there's a little bit more to where it works with the system than ROM booting to ROM-BASIC. ROM-BASIC is more of the condition that you don't have on an IBM system of the PC and most of the PS2 line, that you don't have any other media, any boot media. And so it goes through and cycles you to ROM-BASIC just as a last effort of saying, hey, I need to boot to something. And since that's in ROM and all that is set up, that IBM systems can do that. And of course, that's not doesn't really have necessarily an equivalent in any of the clone system, any of the other manufacturers. And IBM went through, and it's this version, the C 1.0, that is the ROM-BASIC that IBM has in there. So we're seeing it uninitialized. I want to go through and I'll press F2 to run the program. You could go through and just type run as well. But let's look through these values. In fact, let's go through and run it a second time. And we're seeing some values that we're familiar with on that quick video run that it shows very much for the fields. And of course, these fields, if it's a single digit, it doesn't have that leading zero. It'd be a much more complicated program for me to go through and have it'd be a much longer listing for me to get to where I could have each field basically be those two characters and handle the condition for a leading zero. But we have spaces between the fields, so that helps out in a lot of instances here. And doing a run again in the time I was talking, because we see that, you know, the first value over on the far left, that 90 in this case, that is that's like milliseconds or microseconds, excuse me. And then our next field of that 10 or 10 being the milliseconds. Then the next field over, the third field being over, being the seconds of the minute. The fourth value in that E3 location in this instance being the minute, and then for the fourth, fifth, okay, for the fifth listing, which is the E4 field, having that 12 in there right now, because that is the hour. That is the hour that I have set on the real-time clock. The next field over, which should be the E6, I believe. Let me see. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so that is the day of the week. And I went to the convention yesterday when being at Sunday, I set that to 0, 1. And of course, that went through and incremented. It's now 2, which is effectively in that convention Monday, which is correct. It's Monday. The next field over from there for the 7th position, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, is 21. And that is the day of the month. And it's the 21st. And the next position over for the 8th position, or what would be in that E7 hex IO port register, would normally be 02 or 2 in this value, meaning the month. It's February. So it's the second month of the year. The next field, that E8 field, which would be effectively the 9th position that we're looking at and counting left to right, is that C0 field. And again, there's some strange thing otherwise that in the MUL30 real-time clock, C0 represents 20 in 2022 being the year. For some reason, if it were 1981, that field would be F0, the letter F0. And of course, that's hexadecimal, however convention that has. And then the next field over, the 22 in this instance, is the year of the century. So it's 2022. And then we see the values like I plugged in the other day to the real-time clock of the 0. Ultimately, what is 0? That's that EA to EF area, to where I have the 0 for EA hex, 0 for EB hex, 0 for EC hex, 0E, or just E in this instance, for the ED hex, FC hexadecimal for that EE hex port. I hope all this is clear. And then FF for that final value of the EF hex IO port. And those are values that normally in the AST clock implementation was set for like timer functions, but I'm actually believing it's going to take a little bit more study, but I'm believing that is, that may even be update bytes or magic value in there that tells the system, hey, the clock's been updated, or that real-time clock is carrying through some values in some way. So just in the time it's taken, we can see still things turning over. Okay. So we have, the, in this instance, still 10 minutes after the hour of 12 with that date. And again, for the date string, that's still uninitialized. Now we could go through and we could initialize it. We could do, and it just acts on this in an immediate way. We can say date string equals, and you have to put this in quotes, and we're going to say, and if you go through and supposedly the dates you can put in as per the basic reference is you can put in that Tuesday, January the 1st of 1980 that we saw as the default date, all the way up to dates in 2099, I believe, probably even to December 31st, 2099. So we're covered another 75 years. No, I can't count right. It's 77 years from this point, even beyond 77 years. So, but I'm going to put it in as 04, and you put a slash 01 2022, end quote. I want to say if it's April, I want to set April the 1st. So we go through, we have it act on that. If we go through and do things like print date string, it's initialized now and it shows that value. But what we want to go do is go through and we want to run the program again. Here's the program, of course, listing it. We still have it loaded in memory. And we want to go through and run it. And we see the same values. It's still, of course, showing the correct values for the 21st of February, 2022, and the time that I had set previously. So that is not going through. And when I set a date string, it's for the purposes of ROM-BASIC. It doesn't go through and write those values to the real-time clock at all. And so that's just helpful to know that you can't go through, if you have an executive workstation or a Model 30, at least with the revision 02 BIOS, okay, that you go through and have it boot to ROM-BASIC, you can't just go through and use date and time to go through and put those needed values into the real-time clock registers. And so the next time you reboot, it works from what's in the real-time clock, and it'll prompt you and say, hey, time and date is not set. So you have to go through and output the correct values. And that's going to be a little bit more lengthy a program, because I'd probably go through and have it create and prompt the user saying, hey, enter the minute, hey, enter the hour, hey, minute, enter the. So it's a lot easier in the concept of debug, or just a little short brief program that goes through and use, or acting on immediate values, to where you go through and say output this value to this port, not being prompted for what that field value or field location is. That's minutes or hours or century or whatever. So, and I could go through and I could have somebody type in a string, just like the date string, just have another name, some string equals, and then prompt the user, hey, enter the date, and take it and break down and output the values for those fields to the appropriate location, to the appropriate port locations. But it's just a lot easier in debug, as we saw. Okay, so we're going to do this. In fact, like I mentioned, we also have the time string. Let's go through and let's just print the time string. Okay, that's uninitialized as well. And we would have the same thing, to where we go through and if we say, hey, time string equals, and I think in this instance it's quotations, but I think it's colons that separate it. So if we say, hey, let's go through a couple hours into the future here, colon 1700. Okay, so we've gone through and set a value. Let's do again the print time string. Okay, so that's initialized now, but let's go back through, listing the program again and running it. Okay, now in this instance, we see that it still has, of course, that 12 in the 5th position, the E4 hex register, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, still has it 12 in there. And, the 16 being the minutes. So again, the time string input in from ROM-BASIC did not go through and didn't update the real-time clock registers at all. And I'm hoping I'm clear. If you have questions, go through and comment on this stuff, because I'm just wanting to show how ROM-BASIC, in this instance of a MAL30 planar and BIOS revision 02, works with this very unique real-time clock, or RTC, that basically the MAL30 had. The MAL25, being derived from the MAL30 planar, didn't have the real-time clock that the MAL30 had. That Epson Equity 1E, since it's a clone of the MAL30, also has what should be an identical real-time clock, probably the same ports. It's got the same chip at least, and it just makes sense to put it in the same IO port range. And from what I think, ultimately Epson 1E is more than a derivative from the MAL30 on the IBM side. I think it was the design, and just that Seiko Epson Japan was released from contractual, that they were able to produce their own model, having done the Mall 30 design for IBM. And that's pure speculation and theory, but it just seems like a really good theory to me, because there's no other reason to imitate the Mall 30 this close for the MCGA video and everything else. And I do want to put out, and I'll probably get some sort of wish list generated. If you have an Epson Equity 1E, which is the Mall 30 clone, and I'll provide a link to where the only one I've seen out there. I'll provide that link in the video description. But talk to me, get in touch. I want to go through and I want to at least see from the, have something working on the machine. If I can't do it directly, somebody that's willing to run some routines and everything else to go through and to check values. Because for the Epson Equity 1E, it's not an IBM system, and therefore it should not have ROM-BASIC like we see here. Would be the primary difference from the Mall 30. If it does, it'd be really interesting. I don't think it does. And the Epson Equity 1E, I mean, it's a revised design. It was released after the Mall 30. The MCGA, in this instance, the video controllers of the MCGA were actually combined into a single chip. It was an updated design when Epson released the 1E model. So it should have those features, and even would be good to look at the BIOS of that system, whether there's a single BIOS release or whether there was more. It'd be hard to say. I don't even know how many of those things exist. But if you have one, we need to talk. So I guess I can go through and probably, rather than getting turned around, because this is what I wanted to show, that just those going through in ROM-BASIC, you get booted to it, and I'll have to go through and have a boot diskette that I can go through and boot to DOS, and then go through and run that basic or advanced basic stub to get me in basic, to see, whether the same holds true, that whether it initializes that time and date string, which it really, there should be something happening there. And we'll also get to looking at that under the revision 04 BIOS. Now, I want to go through and in the sense of going through and having the executive workstation on the bench like this, I want to go through and I want to have that basically set aside. And since that's a rather unique model, I've got it all set up otherwise to where all I have to do is fix the video. We've got a working system. We probably have the first truly working, and there's some others starting to enter the race because those executive workstations are getting into other hands. And I don't have to be the front runner. I mean, I'm in a shape right now. If we did a foot race, you'd probably beat me. But and we'll get talking about that. No fat jokes, please. But I think I'm going to be the first that's able to go through, but there may be some video geniuses out there that they're more familiar with the insides of a CRT than I am and able to get a little bit more. And this thing looks like it wants to work, just doesn't display any characters, but everything else is there to the display. So I hope it's something simple. But that's occurring right now, and hopefully those other owners of these 7496 executive workstation, and certainly the Model 30 holds true for that, for being a very heavily produced PS2 that's out there. That was my first complete PS2 and operational. I'll pull up my maxed Mul 30 out eventually too and show that. That's a running system. I don't have problem with the real-time clock or anything else. And interesting enough, it has revision 02 BIOS on there. But for the revision 04 BIOS, I programmed some chips up. And that's a whole video topic in itself based on what I had. I can kind of show what I did there and everything in another video segment. But I'm going to go through and have just basically a strip down. It's the same thing as this. It has a Mul 30 planar in it. It's got the riser with the battery in it. And it has a diskette drive, not even a hard drive on it. And we're going to go through, and that's going to be the test bench primarily for the revision 04 BIOS. We're going to see if it's any different from the revision 02. What were the changes? Now, I know one of the changes, revision 04, added on support for a proprietary, very rare hard drive that was released with the last version of the model, the submodel of the Model 30 286. So in other words, the 286 version of the Mul 30 that went through and was more of an IBM AT design, has a real-time clock and a configuration program that's run for that. Had that proprietary 45 megabyte drive that was on the last submodels of that. Real rare drive. And I doubt, being, so many years later, that those are still still functioning properly or anything else. They're out there. I have one myself, and I go through and it gets what's called stiction, the disk in there. If you don't run it often enough, it goes through and it just the drive motor doesn't spin up for the platters, and it's in good shape otherwise. You just have to go through power cycles and encourage that motor. Hey, spin up, and you have to be very, very careful with those old drives like that too. But you do, with it unplugged, you try and do basically a twisting motion to go through and to try and get those platters to spin inside the physical drive. You do these wrist turns. And that does work, although you want to be very delicate. And again, the disclaimer, anything you do as far as what's recommended by me on my channel, you go through and it's at your own risk. But I'm hoping I'm providing useful information to go through and at least fix these 7496, or how to work with them a little bit more, or what to expect. You don't have a boot diskette. You've got the 720 KB drive. You don't have a modern drive to be able to create that boot diskette. So it drops you into ROM-BASIC. You think, hey, I can go through and I can get through that set time and date error in ROM-BASIC. Well, not at least if you have revision 02 of the BIOS. You're going to say, hey, date string equals this, time string equals this. No. So one of my videos too, then probably the next one I'll drop in working with this system, and I'll probably use the Model 30 chassis for that video, is I'm going to go through and I'm effectively going to install a new riser. I'm going to set up the scenario to where I've got a system that real-time battery ran out, or that the riser was missing, and I put on a riser. And I'm going to do it from an uninitialized condition. So I'm going to go through and there's nothing in the real-time clock is not running without the system being powered up. That riser is not powering the real-time clock chip. Plugging the riser and booting it up. And we can go through, probably the easy way in this case is either through debug or this basic routine. That's simple. It's 4 lines. Just a little bit of code to go through and show what the initial condition of the machine is. And it should probably default to that Tuesday, January the 1st of 1980 being that default date. but I want to see the condition of these other bytes, that EA hex to EF hex, what those IO port registers, the values that they have in there, in that new condition, and see how they're set up, and seeing if from like debug we can plug in values to initialize it somehow, or even later on in videos reverting to older DOS versions that should work with the real-time clock in some case. And I'm not blaming MS-DOS 6.21. It should do a BIOS call for the 1A hex real-time clock services to set those values in there. Why it's not in this case, it may still be that revision 02 BIOS thing. That's why we're going to check out revision 04 of the BIOS too. So I certainly hope I give them a lead time of what videos, other videos we're going to look at and examine this. There's going to be a bunch more as we go through and examine this. But I hope this video itself was informative. And certainly, if you think so, click on that like button, please, and leave a comment. I'm always grateful to receive comments and answer comments, to look at things. And of course, my videos are getting out there. Subscribers are growing. That's great. If you're not subscribed to my channel, please consider doing so. Please consider recommending it to your friends that may be interested in this content. And there's another aspect. There's always that tag I put in the videos of help this channel, help support the channel and content through Patreon. I did have even the where you could do the cup of coffee, the $3 thing or whatever. Today I did get a notification of a longtime viewer, and in fact, I've been contacted directly and responded, of course. And sometimes even the messages were getting thrown into spam folders like that. I got to go through and check. But he upped the amount that he's going through and contributing, and it greatly helps. All the items that I have to go through and pick up out there to that I go through and have on the channel a lot of the time, going through and buying a token ring board. I don't have that token ring adapter. Well, I've got to go out and find it on eBay, and it's listed for $30 where else. It's just token ring adapter. I don't, if I didn't have that firmware of the chips or something else, I didn't see that existing where else. I want that to analyze the microcode on those chips. I'll go through and buy it. That's a $30 expense to go through and just have that little bit of input for maybe some video content. I go through, and I'm going to probably do a video on these. This is my new, it's an Anchor product. In fact, I could probably do a video now with and advertise this, the all Anchor video with my Anchor headset. I haven't used my Anchor webcam that I have on the side in a while to show a view. That's another thing I could do. But this also has a webcam and light. This is basically set up for a live streaming situation. And Crosstalk Solutions just went through. It's been a week or two since he went through and showed it. He had received one ahead of sales, and of course did a somewhat of a review of it. That's unpaid. That's I trust his opinion of things, and he did have comments of other people saying, "Hey, that's expensive for what it does. You can get cheaper stuff." Anything else? I like the Anchor brand, and I know in the cases of those channels, I've mentioned this before, that if they say, "Hey," and in fact, sometimes if they've been paid by the company that makes something, "Hey, you got to get one of these." Everybody watching that video, get somebody with a subscriber base of 1 million, 1.5 million subscribers that says, "Hey, you got to do this," or this is something I always wanted to do, or something I always wanted to have. People go through and they respond to that, the viewers, and say, "Hey, I'm going to go out there and I'm a, buy one for myself." So I knew when I got the review, even though it had bad marks from other people that were coming in and talking about it, and it's just Anchor wrapping up a lot of little products into one, and certainly I think it's going to help me on my live streams. But I said, I'll go through and spring for it. It's an Anchor product. I trust the review of it from Crosstalk Solutions. You know, and so I picked one up, and this is going to go through. It's still wrapped up. I've got to go through, and I've had it even, I think, for about a week. I'll go through and unbox it on camcorder and show it off and go through from there, then start to use it to where I'll be behind it. You won't see it anymore, or like a live stream instance. But so you got a little bit more details. You got stuff that's planned coming up, and even the equipment I plan to use. And by all means, if you feel that you can help me in the support of the channel and the content I produce, become a Patreon. It's got the link right there in every video. I'll include this link this time about that. I think it's like Ko-fi, ko.fi. That is, it is a one-time. Each time you go through and donate, and a lot of people, I mean, it's advertised as "buy me a coffee." Well, I'm not going out to a conventional coffee place or something like that a lot of the time. We don't have them around here. Don't have a local Starbucks or anything like that. So I'm not buying coffee, but those $3 increments, it's a donation towards the channel, and it helps. Every little bit helps. So please consider those links as well. But everything else considered, that is all I have for now. This is IBM Museum. Thank you.